Hi guys, thank you very much for the invitation to give a talk. So what I'd like to talk about is, as Katie said, about some of our fabulous beaches down here at Albany and how they can tell us about our planet's very distant past. So this is a double act, so you're getting two for your price of one here. So I'm going to give a little bit about the scientific background about some of the tools that we're very fortunate to have in Western Australia. And then Milo's going to talk in the second half about how we've actually applied these tools to our beach sands. Okay, so I guess one of the great contributions, I think, of geology is the concept of deep time. So that's time that really boggles the human mind. So if our planet formed on the 4.5 billion years ago, on the tip of my finger out here, all of human history would be shaved off by shaving my nails on this finger. So it's really a huge time scale. And the rhythm of that time scale of our planet is described by what we call the supercontinental cycle. And that's the breakup and reaggregation of continental land masses, usually over a time scale of about 500 million years. And this is one of the founding rhythms of our planet. It controls everything from the production of mountain ranges when our continents collide. Those mountain ranges control climate. Climate itself influences biology, influences the production of mineral systems, and ultimately this controls life itself, this rhythm. So how do we tell about this rhythm of our planet through distant, deep time? Well, what I'm going to talk about is a toolkit that helps us read this. So one of the first things we need to know about is the rock cycle, and this is Earth's great recycling process. You can basically start anywhere on this diagram, but what we'll say is we'll start with an igneous rock. So that's a rock produced from a molten magma. It crystallizes, produces numerous different crystals, but those crystals get uplifted in the rock mass and it gets eroded and turns into a sediment. Our sediment then gets compacted, turns into a sedimentary rock. Our sedimentary rock gets subducted, gets metamorphosed, gets cooked in the pressure cooker in a subduction zone, and then it may melt, form a magma again, or magma forms an igneous rock and it gets uplifted. And this process is ongoing over millions of years. The key thing here is that our sediments getting passed off our eroded mountain belts are actually a great archive of all these processes. All the information about all these different chemical processes and all these different earth processes get trapped within our sedimentary grains. And it means they're also in an accessible place we can actually get to them. Our sediments are somewhere that we can sample. So sediments provide our archive of deep time, and that's what I want to talk to you about. So our day at the beach, yeah, we've all seen these black little bands within our sand, our beach sand, and these black bands are heavy mineral concentrations. So they're concentrations of dense minerals, such as ilmenite, rutile, titanite, zircon, all these different minerals. This is an image from our lab where we've color-coded the different minerals. But of principal interest is zircon, and it's a real geologist's best friend. It's a fantastic mineral. We can do so much with these little grains. So it's not just a simple case of our sand grains ending up on the beach and we can relate them directly to our granite that they've eroded out of. There can be multiple steps in this process. So it's not just a simple source to sink transport. There can be multiple transportation events. So our little grain may have come from one granite, gone into a sediment. That sediment gets reworked again, and it finally ends up in our beach sand. So what I'm saying here is we need to understand our full life cycle of our grain to really get the best fingerprint. So I guess if we're in a court of law, we wouldn't want one piece of evidence to convict our suspect. We would want multiple pieces of evidence. So we'll look through the toolkit that we're going to use to convict or find our source for our grains. So the toolkit that we use, and we've kind of specialized this in Western Australia quite a lot, is using isotope geology. So isotope geology is great. It allows us to do lots of different things. It allows us to tell the age of our crystal. That's geochronology. It allows us to tell when our crystal passed through a specific temperature spot, and that's important because it tells us about uplift. So that's known as thermochronology, and we can also get a signature. An isotopic signature maybe tells us where our grain came from. Did our grain come from deep in the mantle, or did our grain come from just melting and remelting of upper crust? Piecing these tools together allows us to directly fingerprint a source. All right, let's move through these very quickly, each one of them, so Milo's got some time to talk. So our first toolkit, if you like, is very much like matching our fingerprint. It's telling us about the crystallization of a zircon grain from a magma. So we've got a molten silicate liquid here that crystallizes and solidifies and forms little zircon grains. Those little zircon grains on cooling produce our igneous rock. So what we can do is we can go and look at our little grains and we can shoot them with a laser or an ion beam in Curtin or in UWA. And that allows us to analyze the amount of uranium and the amount of lead. Now, the cool thing about that is we know the rate of change from uranium to lead. So over time, the amount of the parent isotope decreases, the amount of uranium goes down, but the amount of lead increases. And using sensitive instruments, we can tell the concentrations or the amounts of these different isotopes. We know the rate of change. That allows us to work out the age. So you can see these grains are quite well faceted. These are in granites. In our beach sand, you can see they're much more rounded. They've been through a transportation process. Just to put this into a little bit more of a schematic diagram, if we have two granites here, a blue granite and our green granite, and they're getting eroded and producing our sediment here on this map, our sediments in red, what we get are these sorts of age spectra. So this is age along this axis. So our basement region here, our granites here, have a younger age and this middle age. Our green area has this intermediate age, but also some old components. Mixed together, we get this spectra in our sediments, and we can tell then that our sediment has probably come from these two different regions. Our grains are actually fantastic in themselves, so we can polish these little zircon grains and image them using a variety of techniques, and they can tell us not only about when they formed, but lots of other earth processes that have happened. So this is the scale of a human hair. This is probably my favorite grain I've worked on recently. Beautiful, this is called oscillatory zoning, these kind of beautiful tree ring type patterns. This grain is from Yarrabubba, so on the road between Meekatharra and Sandstone, and it's a 2.6 billion year old granite here, but it also records a 2 billion year old impact event. That impact event recrystallized our grain around the age and produced this really fantastic texture. So by blasting our grain here, we get the age of the original formation of our granite. Blasting the grain here, we get information about an impact event, the oldest impact event on our planet. Here's a piece of the kit we use. Yes, we like machines that go bing, they're very cool. This is just an image of us analyzing different parts of our tree rings to get at different parts of the history. So if we piece this together, I've said we can calculate our crystallization age, but not only that, we can calculate ages for other processes in our rock cycle. So timing of metamorphism, for example. Okay, very quickly onto our next tool. Our next tool here, this stands for uranium, thorium, helium, and this is a bit of a different tool. It tells us about these processes, these uplift processes, before and during production of sediment. So our material is getting moved up through the crust. So the way this works, it's kind of cool. Our little crystal here, our little zircon, at high temperature is losing helium. Our clock has not started. It passes through a blocking temperature, cooling down, and it starts to accumulate helium. So at this point, our clock has started. So it tells us the time our crystal went through 200 degrees C. How do we actually do this? Well, we take our little zircon grain, we put it in a platinum capsule. Make sure we haven't drunk any coffee beforehand, because this is quite delicate work. We shove our little grain into the capsule. We blast another laser beam at it, heat it up, and it releases all its helium. We measure that helium in our mass spectrometer. It's a bit of a slower technique, about 4950 grains in about 4 days, but it's very useful information. Just a quick diagram to explain that and why it's useful to combine techniques. We've got a schematic diagram over here of our different granites in different colors, and they're being eroded and being transported into our sediment in here. We can see the granites have different crystallization ages, but they also have helium ages. Now, the key thing is, if we have two granites of the same uranium-lead age, so B and C, we can't really distinguish between them just using uranium-lead alone. Our sediment could have come from here, or it could have come from here, because the uranium-lead age is the same. But what we can do is we can use our helium to help distinguish between these different sources, because they've got a different helium age. And the really neat thing is we can also tell about a process here. If we look at this example, we've got a volcano. Our volcano has a similar crystallization age as helium age. So in other words, our little grain has formed in here. We've got its age at 75 million years ago, but it came rapidly up to the surface during a volcanic event. So that's where ages would match. So we can tell about crystallization, reworking, and transportation, but we can also even say, hey, we've got a volcanic grain in our hand. Our final technique I want to talk about very quickly is like a DNA match. So much like people coming from Ireland, let's say, to Australia, retain their surname, Murphy, we can get a surname, if you like, from our zircon grains, and that helps us understand, has our zircon grain been produced from melting in the mantle, or has it been produced from melting in the crust? So what have I talked about? I've talked about crystallization and calculating that using uranium lead. I've talked about uplift and cooling, and we can get a handle on that using uranium, thorium, helium. I've talked about actually understanding where our grains were produced in the first place in the primary melts, understanding this magma process through looking at hafnium. Piecing this all together, it's quite amazing, I think, from a single little grain of sand, old age, if you like, we can say something about the middle age of the person or our sand grain using helium. We can say about the birth of our sand grain using uranium lead. But what's amazing is we can even step back prior to the birth to say something about where our material has originated using hafnium isotopes. So tracking all these things together allows us to piece back a very specific indication of where our sand grains have come from. So Milo's going to tell you about applying this toolkit now to our Albany sand.
Cheers, Bree. Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, so like Chris said, I'm going to now, I suppose, transition that to some amazing tools we have available to us, but why is it that we actually are interested in that? Now, obviously, as Chris alluded to, there's an economic aspect to that, of understanding maybe some of the resources that we want to extract. But more interestingly, from maybe my perspective and Chris's perspective, I think is understanding our planet's history, really trying to dig into that archive and understand where our planets come through. So I guess we could start with playing a little game, and I think this is something that you've all probably played before, I hope, is the Guess Who, where you have a number of different characters, and you've got to try and work out which character it is that they have their card by talking about some of the characteristics. But instead of talking about the facial characteristics, the questions you're asking, this time we're going to be looking at some of those geological tools that Chris just discussed, and we're looking at some of these geological characteristics of the grains. So we're going to replace this game and those faces. Instead of looking at their faces, we're looking at specific regions of crust, specific mountain belts. So here illustrated with different characteristic mountains, whether you're looking at Everest. Different collisions have occurred at different times, and we have the characteristic ages of those, and we can look at those geological characteristics to trace back where the sand grains have come from, to link our sediments here in our sink back to where they came from in the source, and using those tools Chris discussed. So if we look at a little paleogeographic map, a reconstruction of where Australia used to be in the past, in the left-hand side here, we have Australia, and you can see that it is bound up against India, Greater India at the time, and parts of Antarctica, forming this larger supercontinent, Gondwana. If we look a little bit more closely at the sample we're going to talk about, a little sample from the beach here on the south coast, we can see that as part of this Albany-Fraser-Wilkes origin, so we have this related portion of crust which all has the same sort of age characteristics, and we can see that that stretches from Australia down into Antarctica. And we can also see this green band up here. So this was a fairly significant mountain belt region that stretched down all through parts of Gondwana that basically reflects when Gondwana started coming together, the different pieces shuffling in against each other and creating these mountain belts. So this is what we're going to refer to as the Kunga origin. And this will come up quite a bit in the discussion. I'll probably come back to this slide just to help you kind of connect back to some of the characteristics we saw in the sand. But try to remember the colors, because we will be using them again. So this is one of these scientific diagrams that we look at. And what we're looking at here is the characteristic ages of different sediments that we find. The vertical colored bands in the background are basically our different mountain belts of those characteristic ages. So in the red on the right-hand side here, if we saw grains that are coming in at this age, it's something that's probably come from the Yilgarn craton. Okay, so very, very ancient. We're looking in 2.5 to 3 billion years old, so extremely long time ago. The blue are characteristic ages from the Albany-Fraser-Wilkes, so that band that we're currently in. If you went and looked at the bedrock around this area, you should be seeing ages that are kind of in those blue bands. And what we're interested here is this green band, which is the Kunga origin. And if we look at the very top here, we have the sand that we looked at on the Albany, on the south coast. And you'll notice that nearly all the grains are located in this Kunga origin. It seems to be saying that we're getting this sampling of this mountain belt. But that's one piece of evidence. And the problem is that you saw how extensive that mountain belt going all the way through Gondwana was. So we know that it's coming from somewhere along that, but we don't know exactly where. Some people could say, well, this is very similar to the Lewin complex is part of that. So why isn't it just coming directly from there? If we look at sediment near the Lewin complex, you'll see that the peaks are slightly different. There's little nuances in the ages that suggest it's not coming straight from the Lewin complex. What is interesting is if we look at sediments off Antarctica, you'll see that the peaks are much more similar. Okay, so this is something we're going to explore a little bit more, and we'll notice that there's similar ages as well in different areas of sediments like the Perth Basin, etc., etc. If we look at, so that's the uranium-lead crystallization age that Chris talked about. Now we're looking at another tool, which is the helium ages. And again, there's these diagrams where if we have this peak, it suggests that that's where most of our data are. And this is the helium ages of the grains that we had. So they crystallized between 500 and 700, and then they became uplifted around 450 million years ago, so relatively rapidly. And if we then start comparing that with different areas around of these different potential source regions, we'll notice that the material from Antarctica, this region in Knox Rift, suggests also this Antarctican origin of the grains. But if we have these Antarctican grains, how did they end up on the south coast of Australia? And if we look at some of the grains themselves, some of the clues start coming out. We have these beautiful images where this grain would have been substantially larger in the past, but it's been rounded off. So we've seen a significant abrasion and reduction of those grains from a transportation process. They've been through the mill. They've seen a lot in their life. Let's try and understand this a little bit better by having a little time travel back through time and tracking Australia. We can see that it's moving back towards Antarctica, rejoining with India. So 150 million years ago, you can see that they had this connection. And as we continue, we're back in the dinosaur times now. If we continue, you can see Australia part of this supercontinent. Still 240 million years, it's still part of the supercontinent. There's a large-scale glaciation. We're still now 340 million years ago, we're still in this continent. So this long-lived connection, we're going back now kind of before we started seeing the transition to land for animals and even plants. So we have quite a different landscape, but Australia was still part of this connection. So we have this very, very long-lived connection with this Gondwanan supercontinent. So once you have these sort of long-lived connections, and you have these mountain belts, these substantial mountain belts, Himalayan kind of style mountain belts, you're always kind of dealing with this weathering and erosion of those mountain belts. They will be kind of losing material, and that material has to be transported from the land somehow. And this is when you start developing these substantial drainage networks, much like you see in the Amazon. There would have also been substantial drainage networks coming from the interior of Antarctica, from some of these large-scale mountain chains we can now still see remnants of underneath the ice, and would have tracked across parts of Australia. And the evidence for this comes in a number of different ways. We can look at parts of imaging in the subsurface, so beneath parts of this is down near Margaret River. We have Augusta here. If we image beneath the surface and we look at what you might have heard of the Bunbury basalt, you can actually see the ancient channels that the Bunbury basalt were actually flowing in. So these are ancient river systems that the Bunbury basalt was occupying as it was flowing. So we see the ancient channels, and the Perth Basin itself is filled with all these sorts of river sediments, up to 15 kilometers thick of river sediments flowing up along this old rift system. Also, this river channel that we can kind of follow, we think is going to relate more to our story. If you follow all the way up to the very far northwest shelf, you can see in these 150 million year old sediments or so, you'll find these channel systems you can map out here. So here's Cape Range, and you can map out all the old ancient delta, basically, of a river system that flowed all the way through Central Australia. And you can pick up evidence of those same age grains all the way through the system. So as evidence of that, we go back to these diagrams, and here's our river sediment at the top. Oh, sorry, not our river sediment, our beach sediment that we looked at down the south coast. And along the way, we found, that other people have found, that there's these peak ages, similar characteristic peak ages, demonstrating that the same sediment was hopping off along the way. And kind of supporting this idea is other evidence that we found on top of the Yilgarn as well, these little ancient pockets of sediment that just remain. So there's these huge river systems flowing across the continents, but every now and then the river doesn't just take the sediment all the way to its final destination. Some are hopping off along the way. They like what they're seeing. And so much like myself and Chris, when we came down here first from Ireland, again, we decided to stay around. So these grains are just demonstrating that the kind of extent of the amount of sediment that was flowing there, and some of those little pockets coming off. And if you look at those ages we talked about for the Kunga, you find it very widespread across Australia, that there was being shed from this central Antarctica many different routes, many different ways that people have hypothesized about how this sediment was being discharged and spread out across the whole of this portion of the continent, trying to basically get to the lowest point, to these low areas on the margin, to the marine systems. So all these different arrows are basically showing different models that people have suggested in the past. With the red one, basically, our new hypothesis from our sand, that there was sediment that came, it sat around on the Yilgarn, and now it's being reworked, and it's now only coming down to the beach. If we look at that beach sediment, usually we see sediment getting mixed. It's getting mixed with all different ages, but we were still much finding this Antarctican, almost pure Antarctican signal. So there must be little pockets of sediment still lying around that are now only being reworked back onto the beaches at the present day. That's still that history, that archive there remaining. So some of those tools that we've picked up on, we've recognized that these age characteristics are characteristic of Antarctica. We're seeing this intermediate storage in Western Australia indicated by the rounding of the grains. They've been through this river system. There's little pockets of sediment that seem to match the age. And what about the hafnium? The final tool that Chris talked about, the hafnium. What does it tell us about some of these rocks of Antarctica? Because we can't really necessarily access the crystals that they came from. So what the hafnium actually tells us that there's a really ancient crust there, and the ancient age of that is similar to something like the Yilgarn that's being reworked. So we're actually telling something new about the rocks of Antarctica from grains in Australia as well. So yeah, the next time you start following footprints in the sand, just be careful how far you might ultimately end up. Thank you very much.